Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Mia Svedeng, and I'm working at the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. I'm a senior policy advisor, and I'm working with all kinds of freshwater issues. So today, I'm going to talk a bit about buffer zones. Today, it's going to be about buffer zones, and you can see my contact information in this first slide. Well, what I'm going to talk about in half an hour, let's see. Well, I cannot see the watch actually now, so you may stop me, Maria, if I'm talking too long. But I will say a few words about the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, and also talk about the riparian area and why we need buffer zones. And then I will talk a bit about the processes that we can find in the buffer zones and different types of buffer zones in agriculture and in forests, and also something that we call ecologically functional riparian zones. And I will talk a bit about dimensions, how broad do we need the buffer zones to be? And I will finish by saying a few words about buffer zones in the Baltic countries, and also a few words about the new European Nature Restoration Law. So let's start. Before I start with buffer zones, I will just say a few words about the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. It's Sweden's largest environmental organization. It's a non-profit environmental organization. It was founded more than 100 years ago, and we have over 200,000 members. And we also have our own environmental label, Good Environmental Choice. And you can see the sign below. It's the green falcon. So I will start to say a few words about the riparian area. What are riparian zones, actually? Well, riparian zones are the interface between the aquatic and the terrestrial ecosystem that connect and help regulate the ecological functions of both systems. So it's the border between land and water. And also we call the riparian areas also floodplains and lands that occur along watercourses and water bodies are the riparian areas. The riparian areas, they provide important habitat for very many species. Many plants and animals live there. And the vegetation in the riparian zone can remove excess nutrients and also sediments and different poisonous substances and so on from surface runoff. And the riparian ecosystems, they generally occupy quite small areas, but they are really very important because they are usually more diverse and have more plants and animals than the upland areas. So it's a really important area, although it might be quite small. So why do we want buffer zones? Why are we talking about buffer zones? Well, the idea of buffer zones, it has evolved since the early 70s. And it started with the intention of better protecting of conservation areas by minimizing the negative impacts of human activities on nature. So it actually came from nature conservation areas in the United States, where they started to talk about buffer zones. And what is a buffer zone then? Well, it's a strip of land with permanent vegetation next to streams or next to rivers and lakes. So it's some sort of a vegetation close to the water that can sort of protect the water course, and also it can also act as sort of a natural filter, can we say? So streamside buffers, they are multifunctional. They decrease pollution in the water. They also control erosion, and they can provide wildlife habitat. So they are multifunctional. They can do a lot of good things at the same time. And the diffuse runoff is really important when you're talking about nutrients. So if you look at these two pictures, which is one that is showing the portion of total nitrogen, and one is showing the total phosphorus, you can see that the biggest part comes actually from diffuse runoff. So the buffered zones are really great to take care of the diffuse runoff. It's really important to mitigate this kind of pollution, because buffered zones, they act as sort of natural filters. So in a natural way, they take care of nutrients and other substances. They can target both phosphorus and nitrogen. And it's important to remember that an optimum situation for targeting, for instance, phosphorus, it is not necessarily the same as for targeting nitrogen. So you might want to prepare different types of buffered zones regarding different types of runoff or different types of pollutions. I will say a few words about the different processes in the buffered zone. As we already talked about, there are processes in the buffered zone that reduce the load of sediments and organic matter and nutrients. And one of the processes in the zone is deposition, and it is due to vegetation. For instance, most of the time it is grass, but it can also be different types of vegetation. They help to slow surface runoff, and they also allow infiltration and sedimentation and deposition in the water. So the water runs slower, and it gets time for particles to sediment, for instance, and also for nutrients and so on to infiltrate into the ground. And also absorption from vegetation, for instance, which is plant uptake, and also the nitrification, which is carried out by bacteria in the water, and which are making the nitrogen to come out from the water. So it's really a very important process. Many different processes in the buffered zone will contribute to take nutrients away. And there are some differences between phosphorus and nitrogen. If we are looking at phosphorus first, phosphorus is often transported in particulate form. So it's transported on little particles, and phosphorus is reduced while passing through the buffer due to the effect of sediment trapping. So sedimentation is taking place in the buffer zone, and particles with phosphorus are actually falling down on the bottom and are trapped in that way. And the effectiveness of phosphorus removal is increased in buffers that can enhance the deposition and the infiltration, and that are decreasing the flow velocity. So to let the water flow really slowly is good for getting rid of phosphorus. And there are also different kinds of soil characteristics that also affect phosphorus behavior. So phosphorus is quite a tricky matter. Phosphorus can be deposited, but it can also be leaked in some places. For instance, if you have poor oxygen, if there is little oxygen, phosphorus can leak instead. So it's important that it's not oxygen deficit in the area. the processes are different with dissolved phosphorus, but it's not dissolved phosphorus that is important. Usually the phosphorus comes as a particular form. So that's really the most important process when it comes to phosphorus. On the other hand, when you look at nitrogen, nitrogen is often transported in solute form. And the removal of nitrogen, it varies very much in different areas and in different processes. Nitrogen is removed through uptake from plants, for instance, and also from microbial immobilization. And also it can be stored in soils, and of course the denitrification, which is also a form of microbiological effect on it. And often the larger the width of the buffer, the higher the efficiency and the removal of nitrogen. So it's often very good to have a broad buffer strip to get rid of lots of nitrogen. And Clement and his cooperators, they found no difference in the rate of denitrification among 3 different vegetation types. They compared forests, understory vegetation, and grass. So many different types of vegetation can function for removal of nitrogen. The most important thing is actually how broad the buffer strip is. But besides from taking away nutrients from the water, buffered zones also reduce erosion. And trees close to a stream or to a lake, they grow deep roots and they increase the riverbank stability, which of course reduces the erosion. So that's also a very important effect of buffer zones, and especially if you have trees or bush vegetation along the stream, for instance. And the third thing, and a very important effect of buffer zones, is of course the wildlife and biodiversity aspect. Buffers that contain trees and bushes, they often exhibit greater species richness than buffers covered merely in grasslands. So it's actually better to have trees and other types of vegetation instead of only grass at the buffer strip. And the trees, they provide also shading, which is really important for the water temperature. It makes the water a bit cooler. And trees also provide organic matter, for instance, leaf to the water, and the leaves and other organic things, they serve as food for organisms in the water. And trees and bushes, they also provide dead wood because they falls down branches and so on into the water. And they provide habitat and protection for fish and other aquatic organisms. So it's really good to have a stream or a lake that's not so very tidy. I mean, to have dead wood in the water is really good for many different aspects. One of them is certainly the wildlife and biodiversity factor. That is really, it's really good with wood and branches and so on in the water for birds and fish and other animals. So this is a citation, a quote from a book. Accepting the look of natural shorelines with many trees and shrubs will be the first step towards restoring habitats for animals using these areas on shore, as well as fish using the trees when they fall into the water. So one of my main takeaway messages today is to not to tidy up too much, to let the trees and bushes and twigs and so on fall down into the water, because that's really good for animals and for both fish and other animals living in the water. I will say a few words about different types of buffer zones as well. because you can use buffer zones in so many different types of areas, and it's always good, even though they can be a bit different in different areas. You can have buffer zones both in riparian forest areas and in farmlands. Often in farmlands, you often talk about filter strips, which is only narrow strips of grass close to the water. In forest, you have forest buffered strips, and they are strips containing trees and grass, and they are often left for protection when carrying out harvesting, logging, and so on. And the third type of buffer zones are ecological functional riparian zones, and they are multifunctional, and I will talk a bit more about those in a while. And how effective a buffer zone is, it depends on different factors. It depends on topography. It depends on which type of vegetation you have in the buffer zone, which soil type you have, and also, of course, the climate, which decides both temperature and how much it is raining and so on. And of course, the extent of the nutrient load. All these factors are important to decide how important a buffer zone is. But probably the most important factor with a buffer zone is the buffer zone width. So that's really important, how broad you make it. And usually the broader, the better. I will talk a bit about buffer zones in different types of areas, and I will start with buffer zones in agriculture. Agriculture, it is, as you know, the largest source of human-related nutrients into the Baltic Sea. It gives us more than 40% of total nitrogen and 30% of total phosphorus. And very much of it comes as diffuse leakage, so it's really hard to target it with special methods at the source. And the main nutrient leakage source from agriculture is over-fertilization practices. So we fertilize too much, and we can do that with mineral fertilizers or with manure. So both types of fertilization gives us leakage of nitrogen and phosphorus. And of course, the loss of nutrients is also correlated with variations in discharge. So if it is raining a lot, of course, nutrients will leak much more than if it's dry, but that's of course natural. So in agriculture, it's common with grass buffer strips. It's a very practical way of managing agricultural fields, and buffer strips along rivers and watercourses can effectively mitigate the movement of sediments and nutrients, and also of pesticides in farm fields. So that's a really good thing to use the grass buffer strips along water courses in agricultural land. They do not require very much space or very specialized maintenance. So it's a really easy and straightforward way to mitigate lots of bad things like too much nutrients and pesticides leaking into the water. So the buffer zones, they can reduce leakage. They function as natural filters, and they actually can remove more than 75% of sediments and more than 50% of nutrients and pesticides. But with that said, I would like to remind you also that there are difficulties in calculating the effect of the measures, and that is especially when concerning phosphorus, because the reduced leakage it is influenced by a lot of different factors, as I already said. When we are looking at pesticides, especially, so the grass buffered zones, they are really effective in reducing pesticide transfer from agriculture field to water bodies. And there are a wide range of physical and biochemical processes that are involved in this process. And their relative importance can vary, but it's really important with grass buffered zones or some form of buffered zones to reduce the leakage of pesticides from farmland. I will say a few words about buffered zones in forest also, because it's a bit different from the ones in the agricultural land. It's quite usual that you leave protective zones with trees and brush in forest when logging and so on. A forest buffer is a zone of forest left for protection adjacent to a water body. So the forest buffers, they can reduce inputs of nutrients and suspended solids and no, I forget the name in mercury, yeah, which is a really poisonous metal. And also, if you leave a protective zone in the forest, you will also have a very valuable terrestrial habitat supporting important biota. So it's really important also for the biodiversity in the forest if you leave a buffered zone close to running water when logging and so on. And some recommendations in forestry is to establish forest buffers along all types of water in the forest. Springs, small streams, along rivers and along lakes. And to function well, these buffers should consist of multi-layered and uneven aged trees. So it should be some sort of a more or less natural wood land close to a tree. That's the best. And the buffer should be, the width of the buffer should be adjusted to the local conditions, such as soil type and topography and which kind of vegetation you have. And also, of course, the discharge area around. And to promote broadleaf trees near forest streams is really good, instead of having firs and spruce and so on, because broadleaf trees, they are better for the soil actually, and they also provide much more organic food for animals and so on, small animals and insects and so on living in the streams. And it's also important to prevent soil disturbance within the buffer, for instance, to minimize off-road traffic and so on. Not to drive with heavy vehicles close to the water, because that will really increase leakage of nutrients and different poisonous substances. A sort of best practice is to use ecologically functional riparian zone. So that's some sort of an optimal buffered zone, which contains all good things in it. So an ecologically functional riparian zone, which was described in a paper by Lind and his co-authors from 2019, they say that to provide as many primary ecosystems function as possible, that's the goal with an ecological functional riparian zone. It will function as a natural filter, producing nutrients. It will also provide organic material which function as a source of energy for organisms in the water, and also as a habitat for in-stream organisms, because organic material as leaves and so on, many small animals live on or in them, of course. The riparian zones will also stabilize the banks of the waterway, and they will provide or capture in-stream wood that is trees falling into the water and twigs and branches falling into the water, which can serve as a habitat for organisms, increase also flow heterogeneity. And in that way, they will also actually can increase at least oxygen in the water by making the water more turbulent and so on. And of course, if you have trees along a brook or a buffer zone containing all these different kinds of, providing all these kinds of good things to the watercourse. So I already talked a bit about the dimensions, and when you want to arrange with a buffer zone, maybe you want to know how broad should I make it then. So then you have to know what is the goal with a buffer zone. If it is to reduce sediments and nutrients in the water, it only requires a quite narrow riparian zone. It can be enough to have 3 to 10 meters of buffer zone to reduce sediments and nutrients leaking into the water. But if you want to protect many organisms and increase the biological diversity, then you require a broader zone, more than 30 meters. So how broad the zone depends on what is your goal with the riparians with a zone. But we can generalize and say that broader is almost always better. So the broader, the better. And in areas with steep slopes, for instance, they require wider buffers than flat areas. That is obvious because, of course, water will flow faster if the slopes are steeper. And to generate stable water temperatures by shading them, forested riparian buffer zone need to be quite wide, more than 20 meters to give good effect. Often, but not always, broader buffer strips give us more retention. And an example is CINEA and cooperators. They estimated how much nutrients could be removed from different kinds of buffer strips. They looked at 50 meters, 75 meters, and they looked at 27 meters broad strips, at 81 broad strips, and 131 broad strips. And they find that more and more nutrients were removed the broader the buffer strip was, which sounds quite obvious, isn't it? And here you can see a figure of this. There is a low but significant relationship between the removal efficiency and the buffer width when you look at both phosphorus and nitrogen and also sediments. So although it's quite varying results, you can see a trend that the broader the buffer, the better the retention of nutrients and of sediments. And to ensure an ecological functional riparian zone, this is a quote from Lind and cooperators. There is no optimal width for ensuring all ecosystem functions and high biodiversity, but a 30-meter wide riparian zone ensures an ecological functional riparian zone with stable water temperature, high flora diversity, and it also delivers sufficient organic material, in-stream wood, and bank stability. So if you can choose 30 meters, it's a really good buffer zone width. But sometimes, of course, you can make it broader, and sometimes you have to make it more narrow. And the width of the riparian zone needed to fulfill different ecosystem services for reduction of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, and also for shading and protecting or promoting biodiversity and plants and animals. As you can see in this figure, is quite different. And you can see that to remove nutrients, it can be quite narrow, but to promote animals and birds, it has to be much, much more broader. So it depends on the goal with the buffer strip, how you're going to organize it. I will finish by saying a few words about buffer strips in different countries, and also a few words about the upcoming nature restoration law, which I think is very importantly and interestingly connected to the buffer zones. In agriculture, there are a few countries that have national regulations of buffer widths in agriculture, but it's used, of course, but we have not had very much regulations of it. In Germany and Switzerland, they require a 5 meters wide buffer zone, and in Sweden, for instance, there are no requirements, but farmers can apply for funding for having buffer strips. So if you have a buffer strip, you can get funding for it because it's considered to be good for the ecological environment. If you look at forest buffer zones instead, there are used for protection in most of the Baltic countries, some kind of buffer zones in forests. There are different types of national legislation and forest certifications and guidelines that determine how the forest buffers are implemented. Narrow buffers around 5 to 25 meters are typically left along small water courses, and sometimes more. And most countries along around the Baltic Sea specify fixed widths in meters. But in Sweden and in Finland, for instance, we do not have any fixed meters. It's only recommended that you leave a narrow strip of trees and bushes, but there are no requirements for it. So it's not mandatory. In Coalition Clean Baltic, we are having a buffer zone project, because we want to push for more buffer zones in both in agriculture and in forestry. So we have had a questionnaire to all Coalition Clean Baltic member countries and organizations, and everyone has had the opportunity to go in and fill in how it is in his or her country. So we want to gather information all around the Baltic Sea to be able to compare different countries and to have sort of a benchmark that we can go out and push for more buffer zones in the Baltic countries. And I think that we can use this also together with a new EU national restoration law that is upcoming now. Maybe you heard of it. It was a proposal for new legislation which came in June this year. And the new restoration legislation, the aim is to restore damaged ecosystems and bring back nature across Europe. And the aim is to cover at least 20% of the EU's land and sea areas by 2030 with nature restoration measures. And then it's also expected to extend this to all ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. So this is the suggestion in short. And this suggestion will now be discussed by all the EU countries and by the European Parliament and the Council. So there are many different articles, of course, in this suggestion, but the Article 9 is about restoration of agriculture ecosystems. And there it is stated that member states shall achieve an increasing trend at national level of, and then they talk about different elements in the agricultural landscape, but one of them is the share of agricultural land with high diversity landscape features. And that could be different things, but one of them is the buffer strips. So this is a quote from the proposal. High diversity landscape features on agricultural land, including buffer strips, rotational or non-rotational fallow land, hedgerows, individual or groups of trees, tree rows, field margins, patches, ditches, streams, small wetlands, terraces, charns, stone walls, small ponds, and cultural features, blah, blah, blah. As you can see, there are many different landscape features that are really good in agricultural land, and that will be restored if this legislation will come into place. And to increase the amount of buffer strips in agricultural landscape would be really good for both for nutrient leakage to prevent that, and also for the biodiversity in the agricultural landscape. Okay, so this was all for me, and my takeaway message today is that buffered zones, they are really multifunctional, and they can reduce sediments and nutrients. And this only actually requires a narrow riparian zone. It only has to be 3 to 10 meters to reduce sediments and nutrients. Grass is okay, even though trees are better. And to protect biodiversity, larger zones are required. Trees and bushes provide shade, food, and habitat, so they provide, of course, much more than just taking away nutrients and sediments. And buffered zones along all streams and water bodies in agriculture and in forestry would improve the environment in Europe and around the Baltic Sea significantly. So that was all from me. Thank you very much. And now I'm stopping sharing.
Thank you very much, Mia. It was very interesting to all of us.
Okay, and now you will go for a field trip.
Tak, ale wait a minute. Now the question.
Okay.
Czy Państwo mają dla Mii jakieś pytania?
Komentarze.
Twoje
doświadczenia. Do you have any comments to Mia about buffer zones?
Dla mnie stałym, permanentnym pytaniem jest.
The question is how wide the buffer zone should be. You said 3 to 10 is enough, and that 3 to 10 ensures already a reduction in nutrients. But you also quoted some research, and in the research, it showed that only 30 meters allows 50% of nitrogen, and to reduce to 90%, it's almost 100 meters in width that is necessary. Isn't this contradictory, the two theses?
Yes, that is true. But also, as I also said, I mean, it's really difficult to state a certain width. It differs depending on very many different factors as soil type and climate in the place and what vegetation you have and so on. So you really have to provide buffer zone that is a special type of buffer zone for each type of environment. But also I said that broader is better. So the broader you can make the zone, the better it is. But I mean, in forest or in agricultural land, for instance, or often you do not want to have a very broad split because it will take away agricultural land. And then I just wanted to say that it can be enough to have 10 meters, even though you, of course, if you have 30 meters or 50 meters, you will reduce the runoff more, but it will take away quite a lot if you have a narrow strip. It's better than to have nothing.
Czy ktoś jeszcze z Państwa ma coś, komentarz?
Nie jest
No
tak,
more. No, it's not true. It's not true that it's better to have a narrow one than to have none. Yesterday, we learned that Poland wants to introduce an eco scheme with 3-meter buffer zones. And in those zones, they will not use pesticides, fertilizers, but they can plow it. The result will be negligible in terms of nutrient runoff, but there will be a propaganda effect saying, yes, Poland does have buffer zones. And moreover, since this is going to be reported, the whole Europe will believe that Poland has real buffer zones.
Yeah, that's really bad. Yeah, because if you are going to have a buffer zone that is functioning, then you have to leave it. I mean, a buffer zone should be a buffer zone. It should be left alone with plants and grass or trees and so on growing on it. If you plow it or cut the trees down or do something like that, then it's not the buffer zone anymore.
Właśnie, Pawle, więc...
Yes, Paweł, exactly. So the eco scheme induces the reader in error. Yes, like the retention eco scheme also induces the reader in error. They are simply faking it. It's fraud. It's greenwashing.
Yeah.
Natomiast to ja w takim razie jeszcze... Ale ja głośno mówię.
Dobra, no to mów głośno.
A czy po angielsku lepiej?
Nie, no Natalia tłumaczy.
Według takiego...
According to an article by Dominic Zak, when we have a low nitrogen load, the efficiency is not dependent on the type of soil, mineral or organic, but if there are high loads, the efficiency of denitrification is very important. So the higher the load of nitrogen, the most important is to have organic soil, and it also should be swampy because we want those anaerobic conditions to be there. If the conditions are not fulfilled, then the buffer must be wide enough. But if it is narrow, it must fulfill those conditions.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's true. And for instance, to allow to have more natural rivers and brooks and so on, and to allow them to flood over, that will also provide areas which can provide denitrifications and so on. So to have natural water courses that can move in the landscape in a natural way is really important to reduce nutrients.
Co więcej, to jeszcze uzupełnię, Dopowiem, tak będziemy dopowiadać. Ważne, żebyśmy mieli na jednym cieku różne strefy buforowe.
And we need to have different buffer zones along one stream, because some are for phosphorus and the others are for nitrogen. If we have organic zone that does not stop the nutrient, then it will absorb in mineral particles. And that if we have floodlands, then it will sediment. So what they don't catch in the river, and what ends up in the river, can then be removed by flooding, by the natural flooding movements. It was just a comment. It wasn't a question.
Yeah, that's true.
Czy ktoś ma, czy są jeszcze jakieś pytania, komentarze?
Any more questions, any more comments? Nothing in the chat? No, there's nothing in the chat. Okay, in that case, we will thank Mia.
Thank you so much. It was very nice, very interesting lecture. And yes, and all the best. We are in touch.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, and thank you to all of you, and have a really nice day in field now then. I hope you will have good weather also.
Będzie.
Yeah.
Będzie.
We have fine weather. We have fine weather.
Fine. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much to all of you. I would like to thank all those who participated and who co-organized this event. And I think for me, this was a very interesting conference with a lot of information, interesting lectures, and with the possibility of casting a look from different perspectives. So this is something that is very valuable to me. Thank you to all the lecturers. Thank you to all the interpreters who undertook the effort of interpreting this, because it's rather a specialized topic. So thank you to all those who are with us listening and who all listening to us online. And I hope we will now go to the field trip. So thank you to all of you who are online with us. You have been patient listening to us, and I hope this was also attractive. And I think this is all for me. Let me just add an optimistic note from the conference. For me, a very good aspect that appeared here by Victor and Maya was that it seems that as a society, we value the fact that rivers and wetlands are important. A few years ago, we had different research results showing that for the majority of the society, a good river was one that it was clean, without the bushes, without the ugly mess, and well regulated. Fortunately, we see now that the poles have changed, and that now we start perceiving rivers as something that can be natural looking, meandering, and with bushes and wetlands around. And this is my what I take from my takeaway from the conference. I hope this is a good signal. Thank you all, and thank you to the Polish Ecological Club. Thank you very much, and we are finishing the conference.